Have you ever really thought about what your brain is doing when you're in a conversation? I mean, is it just kind of like a microphone passively recording sound, or is there something way more complex and, honestly, more creative happening just beneath the surface? Well, it turns out the answer might completely change the way you listen from now on. And this quote, this gets right to the heart of it. Meaning isn't something that's just beamed into your head like a radio signal. No, we build it. Every single time we listen, our brain is acting like a builder, literally constructing understanding from the raw material of sound. And that makes listening, believe it or not, a deeply creative act. For the longest time, we were taught that listening is a receptive skill. You just open your ears and let the sound pour in. But that could not be farther from the truth. Real listening is an incredibly active process. It's a workout for your brain. So, to really get how our brains pull this off, first, we've got to bust a huge myth about what listening even is.
Here's the key. Active listen is not just hearing. It's this purposeful process where we're constantly making sense of sound by connecting it to, well, everything we already know, our memories, our past experiences, our entire map of how the world works. So how does your brain actually do that? It turns out it has two very different but equally important modes for processing everything you hear. Okay, let's think about this with an analogy. On one hand, you have what's called bottom-up processing. Imagine you're studying a huge brick wall, but you're looking at it one single brick at a time. You're focused on the tiny details, the individual words, the sounds. But then there's top-down processing, and that's like climbing on top of the wall and seeing the entire landscape. Here, you're using your experience and the context to get the big picture.
And if you rely only on that bottom-up, brick-by-brick method, well, it can be really frustrating. It's kind of like trying to read a sentence by looking at each word in a totally random order. You see all the parts, sure, but you have absolutely no idea what it's trying to say. The meaning is completely lost.
Now, here's a perfect story of the opposite approach, top-down processing in action. It comes from a traveler in Austria who spoke zero German. When the cashier said something to him, he used his life experience, the general context of being at a checkout, to guess she was asking for a small coin to make change easier. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the situation.
But here's the thing, it's not about choosing one mode over the other. We're not just brick studiers or landscape viewers. The real magic of understanding, the secret to being a great listener, is when these two modes work together. Let me give you a perfect real-world example. Imagine you're standing in Rome, and someone comes up to you asking a question in Italian. You don't speak the language, but your ears pick up one single recognizable word: cysteine. That's your bottom-up clue, the little brick. At the same time, your top-down brain kicks in with the context. You're in a famous tourist spot, and strangers often ask for directions. You put the clue and the context together, and bam, you get it. They're looking for the Sistine Chapel. And this is what scientists calls interactive processing. It's that amazing moment where your big picture knowledge, your top-down view, collides with the specific data from the bottom up. When both of those systems fire up at once, that's when real understanding is born. Okay, so now that we know how our brain listens, the next big question is, why? Because the way you listen changes dramatically depending on what you're actually listening for. First up, there's listening for gist. This is when you're just trying to get the main idea. The overall point of what's being said. And we do this all the time. Think about listening to the news. You're probably not trying to memorize every single detail of every story, right? You're just tuning in to get the main headlines for the day. That's listening for gist. Then you have the complete opposite, listening for specific information. This is where you're actually tuning out the big picture so you can zoom in on one crucial detail. A perfect example is the weather report. You don't really care about the atmospheric pressure systems or the dew point. You're filtering out all that extra noise just for that one specific detail. What's the temperature going to be tomorrow? And finally, we get to the most sophisticated type of listening for inference. This is where you're not just hearing the words on the surface. You're listening between the lines for what's implied but never actually said out loud. For example, let's say you suggest going for a walk, and your friend just looks out the window and says, "It's raining." Now, they never explicitly said, "No, we can't go," but you get it instantly. You infer the hidden meaning. Okay, so knowing all this about how our brains work, how can we actually put this stuff into practice? How do we become better, more active listeners in our own lives?
Well, it turns out successful listeners have this whole toolkit of strategies they use all the time. It's like a cycle. They start by predicting what they think they're going to hear. Then, as they listen, they're constantly inferring hidden meanings and monitoring their own understanding. If something is fuzzy, they clarify it by asking a question. Then they respond to show they're locked in. And finally, they evaluate how well they actually got the message. See? It's not passive at all. It's a full-on sport for your brain.
So if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's that listening is a choice. It's a skill you can actually build and get better at. So the next time you're talking with someone, ask yourself, am I just passively hearing the sounds they're making, or am I actively listening and building the meaning with them? The choice is totally yours.